Hello, everybody, and welcome to Critical Thinking Live from Friends of Europe. I'm Tamsin Rose. Today, we're going to be looking at the issue of how we enhance healthcare equity by making sure we have diversity in our clinical medical research. I, like millions of you, take medication every day, and I do it on the assumption and in the trust that it's appropriate for me, that it will work for me, for my biology, for my lifestyle, and everything else. But what we're increasingly starting to understand is that the clinical research and the clinical trials upon which decisions were made are not necessarily reflective of the type of population that's either affected by a disease or who may be using the medication. So it's time for us to fix that. And I'm really excited that the person who's joining me has a lot of experience and a passion to change all of that. So welcome to Dr. Samit Hirawat, who is the Chief Medical Officer and Head of Development for Bristol Myers Squibb. Hello, Samit, and welcome.
Well, thank you. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. It's a pleasure to be talking to you, and especially for a topic that I'm truly passionate about as it comes to diversity in clinical trials, and in general, diversity as it comes to healthcare and how we can provide best care to everybody and not just to a certain sect of the population.
So let's start by just unpacking the issue. Why is it so important that the clinical research that we carry out and the clinical trials that we use for new medications are reflective of the diversity of our populations?
So if you think about how medicines come forward as they're utilized for treatment of patients in general, they come through because we do clinical trials. And when clinical trials are conducted, they are obviously a critical part of the general development of medicines across all diseases. So generating the data in an appropriate way that applies to the general population and not to a few people or only those people who have the privilege, I would say, to a certain extent, and who are fortunate enough to be in places where they can participate in clinical trials. That shouldn't be the aim. The aim should be that we generate data that is equally applicable to the largest population that is impacted by serious diseases, sometimes even life-threatening diseases. So we need to be able to conduct clinical research in a way that is applicable to all, so that we can bring the most safe and the most efficacious treatments that are transformational for patients, that improve the quality of life as well as sometimes the quantity of life where they're life-threatening diseases. So to me, thinking about diversity in gender, diversity in age, diversity in race, ethnicity, and many other ways of defining diversity becomes very important and plays an important role in how potential treatments may work in patients. It is important to include these diverse patient populations in clinical research for that matter.
Thank you. Now, I know you spent many years in not just in clinical research, but in day-to-day work as a medical doctor working with patients. You know, over the years that you worked with patients, serving them, what was your experience about seeing how there was perhaps a mismatch between the diversity of people you were working with, whose medical problems you were trying to help address, and the kinds of clinical research that you knew were taking place behind the scenes?
We work on a daily basis with clinical trial investigators. We interact with a lot of investigators. And I'm in a fortunate position that when patients reach out, or when my colleagues reach out, or my relatives reach out to ask for either a referral or any input, I always thought that there is a limitation when it comes to, number one, in oncology, which is a life-threatening disease, to always provide a treatment option to patients, because sometimes the drugs had not been tested or the data were not available in a certain sector of the population. If a patient is Asian, but when I look at a clinical trial and the data generated from that, I couldn't quite say that the drug has truly been tested in the Asian population. In fact, certain countries like China or in Japan, they do require that a pharmacokinetic study is done in that particular population, for example, so that the drug's dose and the safety profile is well established before it is approved for that patient population. But we don't think about those things when we think about generally developing drugs. If it comes to asking similar questions for a certain ethnicity or for a certain race of patients. So those things have always been at the back of my mind, and I always thought, how do we bring that forward as we think about the daily life and daily clinical research that we do? So over the last 20 plus years that I've been in the industry and developing drugs, I've always tried to at least look at data from that perspective. I've always thought about how we can generate that data, and that data then becomes important in terms of the labeling of this of the medicines, as well as for physicians to have an opportunity to discuss that appropriately with the specific populations. And by the way, this diversity question doesn't apply only to the US, where I actually live, but it also applies to Europe, where you are. Because Europe, which has obviously many more countries, 25 plus countries in just the European Union, and certainly also in Asia, also in Latin America. So we have to think about it as on a global scale, what that really means, and how each and every physician who's treating their patients for any disease is uh, consistently and constantly thinking about it, and they can truly say that yes, the drug has been tested in your type of people, and the data are equally applicable to your disease in this population, and therefore I'm comfortable prescribing this medicine to you. So that is the kind of mentality I carry with me, and that's what I've experienced, that it is a need of the hour, need of the day, and need of the times, that we need to continue to embark on that mission of generating more and more diversity in clinical trials, so that we can truly speak about the efficacy and safety of the drug in each and every population.
Thank you. And I'm interested particularly in how you, now that you're in a position to change some of those things, how you are turning it not just into sort of a tick box to say, have we got X number of these categories of people in our clinical trials, but how are you using this value of diversity right the way through the way that you work? And here I'm asking, how do you walk the talk of diversity?
Very important question, because talking about diversity for the sake of diversity should not be the reason to have diversity in the clinical trials. To me, the reason to do it is for all the reasons that I spoke about earlier, that to have a true data-based conversation with your patient as you're prescribing a medicine. And that is the reason to do it. And it's not just about doing it by myself or BMS as a company, and Bristol Myers Squibb is the only company who should do it. No, it has to be done by everyone, whether it be pharmaceutical industry, government organizations, investigators, and even the patients themselves can help us by providing the right information, the right data. 3 years ago or so, in 2020, while we were in the midst of COVID, and we were continuing to observe the disparity of the healthcare that was being provided, uh, especially I was seeing it firsthand in the US as well, as the news was coming out, and how patients were being taken care of based on the data evolution. We were seeing certain parts of the society being impacted more than the other parts, and how the treatment was being distributed and applied to in different parts of the society. So in 2020, Bristol Myers Squibb actually came out, and we were amongst the first of those, I think, of the companies to say that we make a commitment to really bring diversity to the forefront. Not that we were not doing it before, but we then put some numbers, and from a dollars perspective as well as objectives perspective, we put it on the table and say, we're going to do a few things. We're going to establish clinical trial centers in communities where the underprivileged and underserved population actually lives. We said we will have a percentage of people represented in our clinical trials that come from the Black African American community. We said we'll have a certain percentage of people who are going to be coming from the Hispanic and Latin ethnicity perspective. So we started from there. And in 2021, we made that effort really count by making it our company objective that we need to have at least, I think I remember, if I remember correctly, that at least 25% of our clinical trial sites for our pivotal trials are going to be in 10 metro centers in the areas where the underserved community or underrepresented community actually lives. I think we had said we will have about 18% of our overall clinical trial population come from the Black and African American communities. Similarly, from the ethnicity perspective, we made those commitments. And we did the same in 2022. And I'm glad to report that we were able to not only achieve those, but go way past it. But that's from the numbers perspective. But what does that really mean from a data implication perspective? Well, what we will be able to see that when these clinical trials do finish and they're read out, we'll be able to then convincingly talk about it and say X number of patients in a given clinical trial were coming from X, Y, and Z community, and the data is equally applicable to all patients who were enrolled in the clinical trial. We've now made even more efforts. What we've now decided is we're going to start collecting the data in terms of diversity of our clinical investigators, because it is generally true that patients are gravitating towards physicians who are treating them, who look like them, who talk like them. So we need to have a diversity in terms of the clinical trial investigators. These investigators can then attract more from the community perspective, clinical trial diversity part. We're also making more efforts in terms of getting more clinical trial sites accustomed to conducting clinical trials, because there is the infrastructure that is missing. And so there are lots of efforts that BMS is making. Apart from BMS as a company, there is a foundational element, and Bristol Myers Squibb Foundation has done an amazing job in terms of launching efforts towards teaching clinical trial investigators, junior faculty, created a program, Robert Quinn Clinical Trial Diversity Program, where every year they've taken 50 odd faculty members coming from diverse backgrounds and training them in terms of clinical trial diversity programs. And the first of those 50 investigators will have completed 2 years this year. And then next year will be another 50, and next year will be another 50. Then they took it deeper and they went to the medical schools, and they have medical students going through the diversity in clinical trials program as well. So we are making a lot of effort from the grassroots levels all the way up to the provider and the consumer part to bring that diversity knowledge, acumen, and then of course the effort that is being applied. So truly proud of what we've been able to achieve, but this is a long road. We have a long way to go, and we're just at the beginning of it.
It sounds like the kind of outreach that you're doing is really building up the capacity and building bridges, relationships of trust with communities that have historically been excluded or discriminated against, communities that have had less access to health service providers and have been treated less well when they've entered those doors. So the ripple effect of what you're trying to create, how do you measure that? How do you think you'll see a difference in health outcomes?
I think we're, as I said, at the beginning of the journey. Certainly, it's not like diversity was missing before. We certainly had representation from all communities in clinical trials. So don't take me wrong. I don't think it's true to say that trials were being conducted only in a certain sect of the population. But there were 2 or 3 things that may have been missing. One, a diligent effort and an intentional effort to have representation from all parts of life, all communities. Second, the data collection was not necessarily consistently applied across all clinical trials. And so we were collecting data, but there were a lot of missing data. There were a lot of misrepresentation, maybe in terms of how the data were being collected and analyzed, maybe. So we have to standardize those, and those are going to be the markers of success of standardized ways of collecting data, reporting data, analyzing data, and then utilizing the data in the clinical trial labels and the asset labels, as well as then how they are then discussed with the by the prescriber with the patient population. What would success look like? It's not about the numbers, but it's more about, can we truly say that people living in affluent areas of a community have same access with the same safety and efficacy profile of a given drug? And can that truly be taken from there and applied to another part of the community, which may be underserved, maybe lower socioeconomic strata, maybe different looking, maybe the African American community, maybe the Latin community, maybe the Asian community, that those data are equally applicable to that community, and that the safety and efficacy is similar because it has been tested, and therefore the prescriber is very confident and the consumer is very confident in taking the drug. Those will ultimately be the markers of success that we'll continue to observe as we go forward. But again, it's not one company, it's not one prescriber. We'll have to have a concerted effort across the geographies to really live up to that promise.
Thank you. I'm really struck by the number of times you've mentioned data and how important it is that the data we collect is accurate, it's representative, so we have better decision making, our scientific knowledge grows. And let me just sort of invite you to think forward a little bit, because we're going to be increasingly using AI, artificial intelligence, both for testing potential molecules for drugs, but also in other areas for guiding clinicians in their decision making. Well, the thing about AI is it gets trained on data sets. And if historically our data sets are unrepresentative, that means we're building that into our future decision making. So can you sort of reflect a little bit more on why it's so critical to make sure that our data sets are clean and accurate so that the AI of the future delivers that health outcome you're looking for?
Oh, absolutely. That's such a great question, because data is the key determinant of successful clinical trial design, its operation, its processing. And if you don't collect the right data, how do you report the data that is properly analyzed? But let me step back and say, it's not that we haven't collected data. So from big data perspective, I think imputation of the data that has been collected is going to be absolutely critical and for our understanding of how we should proceed, and where there is missing data and where there is adequately available data, and how do we marry that data to make some predictions. Machine learning is going to help a lot in terms of that predictability of where we're going to go. So I think we have data. Do we have standardized data is a different question. And that's what the effort is going to be. Lots of clinical trials conducted every year, lots of money obviously invested in clinical trials, and the AI tools are helping. I'll give you just one example. If we look at the collection of information for clinical trial investigators, the form, for example, that the FDA has, it does not have a column or a box that says, is the investigator male or a female? So we're not collecting the gender diversity right from the word go. But AI is an amazing tool that you can use, and you can train on training data sets. We can train artificial intelligence, machine learning tools are available, where one can start to decipher based on the name and naming conventions and how the names are written. You can start to create a data set that can start to tell you the gender diversity based on just the names. And we've been able to utilize some of that to start to accumulate information around what we have available in terms of names in the databases and whether they're male, female, and all. But that is obviously not the right way to do it. So now we are creating tools to truly collect the data. But it's a good start. We have to continue to build on that. Similarly, we have to start looking at other parts of the data set. For example, when we collect data on whether a person is Caucasian, whether a person is African American, and other parts, other races, etc., sometimes a patient who's filling out those forms stops at the Caucasian part but doesn't go into the ethnicity part. So we don't know if a Caucasian person is a Hispanic person, Latin person, or something else. So we don't have that data. And so we are underreporting the representation of Hispanic and Latin patient population. So those are things that can be helped, because a name coming from Spain or from Mexico who's a Caucasian, is that person Hispanic, Latin, or not? I think AI machine tools can really help us start to use that. So I think all of those tools will help, will be very important in starting to create a data set that can be utilized for future purposes, and then strengthen our understanding of how to analyze diversity in clinical trials and beyond. Hopefully that helps answer your question.
I think it does. I'm interested now in how your experience could be useful to Europe, because we're right in the middle of creating something called the European Health Data Space, which is our first attempt to federate and pull together data that currently sits in silos all across Europe. And as part of it, there's going to be a big effort to harmonize data. And you've just said part of the challenge is we're not necessarily collecting the right data, we're not disaggregating it. So what advice would you give, first of all, in the design of the way that you construct your databases? And secondly, we're revising our pharmaceuticals legislation for the first time in 20 years. And we're looking at things like clinical trials, we're looking at health technology assessment. So again, what guidance would you give from your side to say, these are the key things you should do that would encourage the kind of respect of diversity that's needed?
So let's start with the first one, the European health data space. I think it presents a legal framework to enable the use and flow of health data between health providers and across the European Union. Now, if it is implemented, and funding is going to be very important, and if it is funded appropriately, it could lead to a better diagnostic capacity, to boosting the scientific research to enable companies to create more tailored medicines and services. Obviously, the pharmaceutical industry supports this move toward the effective data-driven healthcare systems in Europe. We do have a role to play in terms of capturing, analyzing, and sharing the high-quality data, which hopefully will demonstrate the diversity of patient populations. Now, staying compliant with the data privacy mandates and adhering to the regulatory best practices, it has always been and will continue to be of utmost priority in our industry. And ultimately, the ongoing modernization of European healthcare system is a shared ideal, and we all support that part. Now, from a ecosystem perspective that fosters and nurtures the R&D efforts, well, 20 years ago, the amount invested by the pharmaceutical companies in research and development in the US and in Europe differed by about maybe $2 billion. But by 2020, that difference has increased. It's about, I think, $25 billion now. So in the past 30 years, the share of new treatments that have originated in Europe, it has dropped from 1 in 2 to 1 in 5. So there's a major difference if you think about what's happening in the European part versus the United States, as how healthcare research is growing. Now, the revision of the general pharmaceutical legislation that you talked about, it is a key opportunity to protect and future-proof Europe's life science sector. However, I would say that we are concerned about the impact the proposed reduction in the regulatory data protection period from 8 to 6 years would have on the retention and further attraction of research and development in Europe. That truly is a concern. Now, getting the revision right will ensure that Europe stays attractive for future research and development investment. So I think all of those are going to be important, from, as we spoke about, the data, the analyzing of the data, and of course, presenting the data so that it's applicable across. But on the other hand, to further the research and development in Europe, one has to really look at the legislations that are coming through and how they will be applied.
Thank you. I'm wondering how, creating the diversity both of participants in clinical trials and therefore the data that's produced, do you think that is a driver towards this new frontier of precision medicine, of personalized medicine? Or is it something that if we don't get that data right, we can't achieve the vision of personalized medicine? Because increasingly, I was speaking to some oncologists a few days ago, and they said, look, in the future, we won't be having single big blockbuster drugs. We'll be having much more targeted treatment as we understand how much more personalized people's tumors are. So do you see this focus on diversity of data collection and participation in trials as being the missing link to the future of personalized medicine, or is it just an enabler amongst many others?
Good question. I think it's more of an enabler rather than the driver of precision medicine, at least the way we understand it today. Personalized medicine, in the true definition that is applied today, is driven more through the genetics of a given disease. So, for example, we go back maybe a couple decades. Lung cancer used to be small cell lung cancer and non-small cell lung cancer. Today, lung cancer is probably 9 different types of lung cancer. Non-small cell lung cancer has been subdivided because of the mutations in the tumor that we see, genetic mutations that we see, into KRAS-driven tumors or EGFR-driven mutated tumors, or ALK perturbation that has happened, or the RET mutations, or the BRAF mutations, and so on and so forth. Same applies in other tumor types where we are finding these single genetic mutations that drive the tumor, and therefore we are able to find drugs that specifically target that mutation. But it is also true about certain diseases that they occur in certain ethnicities. Ashkenazi Jews, for example, there are certain rare diseases that occur in that population, and so it is driven through there. So it is one driver amongst many that apply to precision medicine. So therefore, collection of all of that information as a whole becomes important. So I don't think it's one versus the other, but rather one and the other that will drive the continuous evolution in our precision medicine understanding. There are drugs. I remember a few years back, maybe a decade or so, maybe more, anti-hypertensive drug, which had more efficacy in a certain racially driven population, and not the other. And it was important to know so that you prescribe the drug appropriately to that part of the population and not to the other where it's not effective. So those are certainly drivers, part of the driving formula in terms of how precision medicine should be developed and practiced, but not the only driver.
Thank you. And my last question for you is, what would success look like? Particularly here, I'm thinking in Europe, in the next 12 months, we're about to have the big game of musical chairs. We're going to have elections for the European Parliament, so a bunch of fresh faces arriving. We'll have a new College of Commissioners. At the end of their mandate in 5 years, if we've managed to get much greater diversity in clinical trials, what would it look like?
So let's start 1 second with the European elections. I think we know the part that we talked about earlier, the general pharmaceutical legislature, it will take some years to be finalized, I guess. And it is probably once in a generation opportunity not to be missed. So I hope the EU decision makers, the current ones and the future ones, will use the next few years to future-proof the European regulatory framework, as I spoke about earlier, so that science-driven companies, such as Bristol Myers Squibb, see Europe as a competitive environment for investments and research and development and manufacturing, and truly continue to live up to that world-class standard of healthcare that is available, and continue to grow from there onwards, and come back to what I spoke about earlier, 1 in 2 drugs being discovered and developed and brought forward rather than 1 in 5. And I hope that we don't continue to increase the gap. What success looks like to me, I hope there comes a day when we don't have to think about diversity and say we need to have our diversity in the clinical trial, but rather it comes naturally that we open opportunities for patients to participate irrespective of what zip code or PIN code they live in, that they have the ability to access healthcare in an equal fashion, whether it be clinical trials or approved medicines. I hope that we not only look at diversity today, that we look at from a gender perspective or from the skin color perspective or ethnicity perspective, but one of the pilot programs that we've just launched is to also look at sexual orientation, gender orientation from the LGBTQI plus community perspective, and we are beginning to collect the data, because there is that inherent bias that is still there in terms of who should or should not participate in clinical trials, and people are making decisions without understanding the reason for it or no reason for it. And therefore, we need to continue to grow our knowledge and continue to see where we can impact that and not let that bias seep in. We are in the early parts of that, but that data is going to become very important. And then we need to start looking and thinking how we can continue to bring that forward, even in other parts of the world where maybe it's not about skin color and ethnicity, but it may be something else that we need to take care of. I come from India, and I can tell you over there, socioeconomic strata is going to play a big role, how we look at diversity, so that it's not only about the affluent society that gets to participate, but rather everybody gets to participate in clinical trials. So those are going to be markers of success for me as I look to the next part of this decade and maybe even into the next decade.
Thank you, Samit. It has been really wonderful talking to you. And the lesson I take for this is we know that health matters to Europeans. It has always figured very highly. Every time there's a Eurobarometer survey that asks citizens what they want. But the pandemic really brought it into sharp focus, and it became a priority for politicians as well as citizens. And it also revealed to us the quality of life that you had during the lockdown and as a result of pandemic really did depend on the housing you had, the green spaces you had access to, what transport and your environment. So we're seeing really a new focus on how you build equity in society. So I want to say the message you've given us about the power of diversity in the way that we approach clinical research as a means to build equity, engage with other communities and bring them closer to it. I think it's a really positive vision. I think it would be a big step towards equality in society. So I salute you for all the work that you're doing. Thank you for the leadership that you're showing on this. And thank you for joining me today. And for everyone else.
Thank you so much. My last thing I would say is we are global citizens. Healthcare is one thing where geographical borders should not matter. So I'm hopeful, I'm truly hopeful for the society of the future that we can bring healthcare to all and not just for one.
Thank you very much. And we'll see you all again soon at the next Critical Thinking Live from Friends of Europe. Thank you and goodbye.